The city whispered his name like a warning. Rocco Valenti didn't need introductions. Roll calls happened in the shadow of his suits and the sound of glass breaking at his parties. He ran his world with iron and calculation, an empire built on fear that stretched into neighborhoods, boardrooms, and the quiet corners of hospitals where politeness met power and stepped aside. When his son, Nico, fell ill, Rocco commanded the best, not because he trusted doctors, but because he believed money could bend fate. They brought in 100 doctors. Specialists arrived with briefcases and soft shoes, academic degrees and clipped accents, each convinced they would name a villain and defeat it. Tumors were mapped, blood work printed, scans lit up in sterile blue. For every confident diagnosis, there were 3 contradictions. One doctor prescribed a treatment, another warned of negligence. Charts multiplied, opinions stacked like playing cards in a house that refused to stand. Therapies failed. Tests that should have been routine became riddles that no one could solve. Nico lay between pillows in a room the size of a small chapel. He was 23, with eyes that looked younger than his years and a laugh that used to be loud enough to cut through the tension of a room. The illness had stolen his voice and much of his mobility. It stole the rhythm from his hands. Rocco visited only twice a week, more to stage his authority than to stay. There is a part of him that loves his son like a man loves the last clean shirt he owns, possessive and practical, but not soft. At the hospital's back door, where the janitorial staff came and went like islands of movement in a sea of stillness, there was a woman named Lorraine. She had worked nights cleaning rooms for longer than most of the junior doctors had been alive. She moved through the sterile halls with the discreet dignity of someone who serves and is unseen by choice. Her daughter, Amara, came with her sometimes, clutching a backpack that had seen better years. Amara was bright-eyed, bookish in a way that made people think of libraries and late-night tinkering. Amara had a mind that did not fit the smallness of her name. She'd grown up listening to whispered lectures from the hospital waiting room, to the recited findings of students practicing bedside manner, to the rhythm of machines that beeped and sighed like a second language. While other children played, she read medical journals sourced from the public library, emailed researchers with questions, and scavenged discarded conference programs for headlines she could follow. Genius is a messy word, she thought. She preferred curiosity shaped into stubbornness. Word of Nico's case spread through the hospital, not in the glossy way Rocco intended, but in the human, hushed exchanges that meant something different. Sympathy, fear, the taste of challenge. Amara had watched Nico once from a distance. Machines surrounded him like sentries, and he looked smaller under the weight of treatments that had failed him. She felt an odd tug, an obligation that had nothing to do with the Valenti name and everything to do with the principle that no suffering should be left unexplained. She asked Lorraine about his condition in the same way she asked about interesting case studies, eager, direct, unembarrassed. Lorraine answered in fragments: neurological decline, ambiguous inflammation, a cascade of symptoms that didn't fit known patterns. Lorraine also told her the part about the 100 doctors, and how Rocco's men had barged into conferences to demand second opinions as if authority could be rented by the hour. Amara started her nights in the laundry room, folding sheets, counting detergent scoops, and stealing minutes to read. She mapped Nico's reported symptoms against anything she could find: autoimmune disorders, rare infections, paraneoplastic syndromes, toxic exposures. Most of her leads fizzled into dead ends. Then she noticed a pattern in the way his degeneration progressed. Small, episodic regressions that correlated with a variable almost no one was measuring: the hospital's water usage log for the floor he was on, and the timing of certain construction projects that had recently run on diesel generators. It would have been a flimsy thread if she weren't stubborn. She knew about environmental toxins, the ones that hide in plumbing, in older paints, in underground pipes, because Lorraine had once warned her about living by the river where factories used to dump. Amara cross-referenced hospital maintenance records she scrounged from the night office and noticed a maintenance crew's notes. replacement parts drawn from an older wing, a chemical cleaning agent used during renovation, and a contractor who had certified a series of filters as compliant though they'd been sourced from cheaper suppliers. She wasn't a physician, and she knew the danger of making claims that could be dismissed as the dreams of an amateur. So she did what she had always done. She built a hypothesis and then tried to test it, quietly and without fanfare. She collected data, water samples from the sink in Nico's room, air filters discarded by the maintenance crew, a scrap of contaminated cloth found under an old radiator. She made graphs on scrap paper, scribbles that later became neat prints and charts she carried in a battered folder. The day she slipped the water sample into a lab technician's hand, she expected to be ignored. Instead, the technician, Mr. Chen, looked at the readings and swallowed. There were compounds present at levels that suggested chronic exposure. They didn't fit a textbook name. They fit the messy arithmetic of industry. Byproducts, contaminants, something a poor procurement decision had allowed to circulate. Amara presented her findings to a neurologist on the staff, Dr. Morales, who had grown tired of headlines and wanted to see if one more theory could be disproven or validated. He read her notes, and his face taught itself into attention. He authorized a broader series of tests: blood chems, cerebrospinal fluid assays, an environmental audit. The tests came back with a grim agreement. There were markers consistent with neurotoxic exposure. Not an infection. Not a tumor. Something slow, surgical in its cruelty, eating at the synaptic scaffolding that helped Nico speak and move. Rocco was not a patient man, and if a janitor's daughter thought she saw what 100 doctors could not, he would have laughed. He never met Amara in a way that was anything but transactional when Lorraine introduced her. "My girl's smart. She thinks she can help." Rocco's eyes narrowed. The word smart had been used against him too many times to make it a compliment. He thought of his son and saw, beneath the sheets, a future folded in half. He wanted a miracle, but wanted it ordered, quick, private, and absolute. But the miracle Amara offered was not a swaggering theatrics. It was data and a plan. Remove the source, chelate the toxins, institute slow neural rehabilitation while simultaneously protecting Nico systems from further exposure. She outlined a regimen that read like a negotiation between biology and logistics: filter replacements, for chelation under strict monitoring, targeted therapies to promote neural plasticity and reduce inflammation. It was a treatment that required patience, transparency, and the cooperation of a hospital that had something to hide. Rocco's men would not like transparency. When he asked her to outline her methods, she did not speak in guesses. She handed him the charts, the lab reports, the maintenance logs. He scanned the pages like a man counting money. Somewhere around the third page, his jaw stiffened. The evidence implied negligence. If not negligence, then negligence's cousin, indifference. Pipes were old in the hospital wing Nico had been in. Contractors had used solvents that were inappropriate for a facility treating neurological patients. Filters had been switched with cheaper units during a cost-cutting initiative months before Nico's first symptoms. Rocco put security on the maintenance department and on the contractors. He demanded an immediate replacement of the filtration systems and ordered the hospital to allow the targeted chelation under a doctor he chose personally. They found a surgeon willing to do the IVs under supervision because the paper trail now forced them to. Dr. Morales oversaw the clinical protocol, and Amara became the unlikely coordinator, sleepless, tireless, a translator between data and practice. The first weeks were mechanical and cruel. Nico's body resisted. The toxins had already lodged themselves in neurons that don't like being woken from long sleep. There were setbacks, fevers, moments where his hands trembled and spat back to the paralysis that had become familiar. But under the regimen, biochemical markers shifted. Small, stubborn improvements appeared like green shoots in winter. Nico opened his eyes with more curiosity, not glass, and once, when the nurse left the room door ajar, he hummed a few notes, half a melody, but unmistakably his. Rocco watched from the periphery, a man learning how to be smaller than his problem. He hovered like a shadow, present and unspeaking, his admission of helplessness disguised in terse orders. The Valenti name bought him a private room, the best medication, the best 4 stands, but what it couldn't buy was the patience the treatment demanded. When fear gnawed at him, he threw money at the problem, and money ricocheted against something that needed time. Amara, for her part, moved like someone operating without an audience. She slept in a pull-out chair for nights on end, pacing in the sterile corridors with a mug of instant coffee and a folder of notes. People began to notice. Nurses who rarely noticed anything beyond their shift hours began leaving small sandwiches outside her chair. Lorraine started bringing her old sweaters and a pot of soup. Trust is not given in corridors run by authority. It grows like mold in places where kindness is left to seep. There were threats. The contractors, cornered, tried to pin the blame on a subcontractor who'd since disappeared. Insurance adjusters crawled out of formal offices with pinched smiles. A politician called Rocco to warn him that exposing certain names would incur dangerous enemies. Rocco's world was a calculus of consequence. Exposing the truth might mean more than a damaged reputation. The choice fell to him, and for the first time, he weighed his boy's life against his empire. He chose Nico. The trial of healing, the slow war against toxicity, required the hospital to own its mistakes publicly. Rocco, who had always avoided the limelight save for celebratory reasons, stepped into the news in a way he'd never planned. He held a press conference that tasted of iron and apology. He forced the hospital to fund an overhaul of its facilities. He ensured the contractors were fined and replaced. He made sure his name was front and center in the statements about reform. But the real consequence belonged in quiet rooms and patient charts. After months of chelation and therapy, Nico's speech came back in fragments at first, single words like coastlines reappearing on a map. He learned to hold a spoon again. He learned to type with 2 fingers, then 3, then more. He laughed more easily, a sound that startled those who had grown used to a darker soundtrack in that family. When he finally walked a few steps without assistance, the corridor outside his room erupted in a way hospital corridors are not meant to erupt. Nurses and janitors, and a handful of doctors who had stayed beyond their mandates, cheered in a chorus that startled the antiseptic tiles. Lorraine wept with the kind of relief that undid the seams of a lifetime. Rocco stood there as if the applause were wind. He had always expected victory to feel glorious. Instead it felt private and small and crystalline. He met Amara alone one evening in the hospital garden, the place where the air smelled faintly of cut grass and the city felt far enough away to be irrelevant. He had embraced power his whole life as a shape to hold pain inside. Now he carried a different calculation: gratitude. He offered her a check the size of a man's ego, to pay for her education, to keep her safe. Amara refused at first, not because she didn't need help, but because she had never been comfortable accepting a life handed like a trophy. Rocco's face, usually carved from marble, softened in a way that surprised him. He told her something he rarely admitted aloud. He didn't know how to say thank you without buying it. Amara shook her head with an old kind of fatigue. "Don't buy me," she said. "Teach me. Use your money to change the hospital, not to make me less uncomfortable. Promise me the next child who gets sick here won't have to compete with negligence." He promised, clumsy and sincere. It was the first time in years his voice didn't command a room. It asked for a future. Nico and Amara developed an unlikely friendship. He would joke, at first haltingly, about being spoiled and then humbled. She taught him to laugh at small things again, and he taught her how to sit in a leather chair and endure the silence that used to be policed by power. They spent afternoons in the garden where he learned that intelligence could be like a hand extended. Sometimes it pulled you across a gap, sometimes it held you steady while the ground rearranged. The hospital changed, slowly and not without internal fights. Filtering systems were updated, procurement policies rewritten, and an anonymous fund was instituted to support environmental audits in old facilities. The contractors were held accountable in a way that read like precedent, and the city took notice because Rocco's name made notice unavoidable. But the true victory wasn't policy. It was in the quiet measuring, fewer mysterious cases, better maintenance logs, a neighborhood where a child's laugh returned to its rightful place. Lorraine retired a year later, smiling in a way that finally matched her eyes. She watched her daughter leave for the university on a scholarship that bore Rocco's name, a bitter sweetness folded under pride. Amara studied environmental toxicology and biomedical engineering, a discipline she felt comfortable blending with the compassion she'd been taught in the janitorial closets and in the hospital's dimmed corners. She returned, not as a janitor's daughter, but as a scientist who knew how to bend numbers into justice. In time, Rocco learned to speak less and listen more. He found that power softened around purpose. He still mattered, but now he also had a way to measure his meaning beyond profit. He would walk through the refurbished wing sometimes, unnoticed, watching the new filters hum and the sensors glow like small promises kept. Nico, stronger and quieter in a way that suits survivors, would stand beside him, sometimes resting a hand on his father's arm with the ease of reclaimed life. People told versions of the story that made it sound like a fairy tale, a cleaning lady's daughter who healed the MAFIA boss's heir. The truth was fuller and messier. It held negligence and courage, greed and reform, the kind of small kindnesses, sandwiches left at midnight, a folder kept safe, that accumulate and become rescue. It was not a single moment but a long, structural choice. To look where no one else wanted to look, to attach your curiosity to service, and to force accountability when the margins prefer to hide. Amara never wanted to be the hero on a billboard. She preferred the laboratory and the long nights when data turned into answers. But sometimes, when she walked the garden and saw Nico laugh loudly enough to startle a sparrow, she allowed herself to feel proud in a way that wasn't cramped by expectation. She had healed what 100 doctors couldn't, not because she was better than them, but because she refused to be invisible and refused to accept the convenience of assumption. The city continued to whisper names, but now when it spoke of the Valenti family, it included an addendum. Sometimes the most powerful thing is not the force you wield, but the moment you choose to use it for someone else's life.